I've always been proud of my garden, not because it was the biggest or fanciest in the neighborhood, but because I built it myself. Every inch of soil, every blooming rose, every inch of the wooden fence around it was a piece of my time and effort. It wasn't just a garden. It was therapy after work, a sanctuary where I could breathe. But one morning, all of that changed. It started like any other Saturday. I was sipping my coffee, looking out the kitchen window, when I heard the low, rumbling growl of heavy machinery. At first, I thought one of the city crews was repairing a pipe nearby. But then, the sound grew louder, closer, until the ground itself began to tremble. I stepped out to the porch, and that's when my heart dropped. Right there, in front of my house, a bulldozer was parked halfway up my lawn. A crew of men in neon vests were standing around, and my prized garden, the same one I'd been nurturing for 5 years, was being torn apart. The air smelled of crushed plants and diesel. My wooden fence splintered. The rose bushes flattened. The irrigation pipes ripped clean out of the ground like they were nothing. I ran over, waving my arms. "Hey, what are you doing? Stop!" I shouted over the engine. One of the workers turned to me, his face blank. "We were told to clear this. HOA orders." I froze. HOA orders? Before I could process what that even meant, I heard a familiar voice, sharp, confident, and dripping with authority. "Well, it's about time this eyesore was gone," she said. I turned, and there she was. Margaret Benson, the president of our HOA. Neat beige suit, clipboard in hand, that smug look she always wore whenever she reminded someone about community standards. "Margaret, what is going on here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't even look at me at first, just gestured toward the half-destroyed yard. This garden was in violation of HOA Code 14B. Unapproved structures, non-compliant fencing, and unsightly overgrowth. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Unapproved structures? Margaret, that's a wooden trellis for the vines. You've walked past it 100 times. Her lips curved into that condescending smile. You were warned multiple times. You didn't respond to notices, so the HOA authorized removal. Removal? I snapped. This isn't a broken mailbox, Margaret. This is my property. You can't just bulldoze someone's yard. But she wasn't listening. She turned to the workers again. Finish the job. For a moment, I just stood there, watching as the machine roared back to life, tearing through the last patch of green I had left. All I could feel was this cold, heavy mix of disbelief and fury. I wanted to scream, to stop them. But in that moment, something else took over, something calmer. Because as I stood there, watching Margaret boss around the crew like she owned the place, I realized something she clearly didn't know. She thought she was in control. She thought she was dealing with just another homeowner who'd roll over and pay fines. But Margaret had just made a very big mistake. Because the company she'd hired, the one responsible for the destruction she was so proud of, was my company. The same construction firm I had built from the ground up. The same one that she had unknowingly contracted for this cleanup project. And as I watched the last of my garden crumble, I made myself a silent promise. She was about to learn exactly what happens when you bulldoze the wrong person's property. The next few days were chaos. My front yard looked like a war zone, shredded soil, crushed fences, tire marks, cutting through what used to be flower beds. Every time I looked outside, it hit me all over again. My sanctuary was gone, replaced by a pile of dirt and broken wood. I spent the weekend trying to clean up what I could, still half expecting someone from the HOA to apologize, or at least offer to fix the mess they'd made. But of course, that never came. Instead, on Monday morning, I found an envelope taped to my door. A fine notice. Failure to comply with community landscaping standards. It read, penalty $1,500. I laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd that it was the only thing I could do. They bulldozed my property, and now they were fining me for the damage. That's when I knew this wasn't just about some garden code. This was personal. Margaret had always been the type to flex her little bit of power like it meant something. She treated the neighborhood like her private kingdom, handing out warnings for things as small as leaving a trash bin out for an extra day or using the wrong shade of white on your mailbox post. She'd made enemies before, but most people just gave up fighting her. They paid the fines, fixed whatever violation she pointed out, and kept their heads down. But me? I don't play that game. So, I decided to pay her a visit. The next HOA meeting was in the clubhouse, one of those spaces that always smells faintly of coffee and stale carpet. I walked in, and there she was at the head of the table, sitting tall like she was chairing a board of directors instead of a neighborhood committee. The room fell quiet when I entered. Everyone knew what had happened. Word spreads fast when someone's yard gets bulldozed. I walked straight up to the front. "Margaret," I said, keeping my voice even, "we need to talk." She gave me that same smirk I'd seen the day of the demolition. "Oh, Mr. Taylor, glad you could join us. I trust you've received the notice about your landscaping violation?" I could feel everyone watching us neighbors who were too afraid to speak up, people who'd suffered under her endless rules. "Yes, I got your notice," I said. "And I also got your bulldozer through my front yard. So maybe you can explain how destroying private property fits into community standards." Her expression didn't change. "Mr. Taylor, the HOA board acted within its rights under Section 14B. You were given multiple warnings and chose to ignore them." I leaned forward slightly. "I didn't ignore them. I responded twice. Your office never replied." She raised an eyebrow, pretending to check her papers. "I'm afraid there's no record of that." "Of course not." Conveniently missing. That's when I decided to stop arguing. You can't reason with someone who enjoys control more than truth. So I just smiled. "Well then, Margaret, I suppose I'll have to take this up another way." Her eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Let's just say I know the company that handled your little cleanup project." There was a flicker of confusion in her face, brief but satisfying. "Oh, and they're going to make things right." I turned and walked out, feeling every set of eyes on me. Inside, my anger was boiling, but right beneath it was something else: clarity. Margaret had no idea that the crew she'd authorized was mine. My company, my equipment, my people. She thought she'd humiliated me, that she'd bulldozed some ordinary guy's garden to make a point. But she'd actually signed off on her own downfall, and she didn't even know it yet. Over the next few days, I pulled up every document I could find: HOA authorizations, payment records, invoices. I had access to it all through my company's system. And when I saw her signature at the bottom of the contract, that's when I knew I had her. When I realized Margaret had signed the contract that sent the bulldozer onto my lawn and that the crew was from my own company, the first thing I felt wasn't triumph. It was a cold, slow clarity. This wasn't just about getting even. This was about making sure she could never weaponize municipal power or community fear against an ordinary family again. I could have stormed into the HOA office, screamed, and demanded justice. That would have felt good for a minute, but it wouldn't have lasted. Margaret had allies, a smug board, a few quiet neighbors who let her run the place, and, most dangerously, the appearance of legitimacy. People believe what looks official. So I decided to build something official that was harder to dismiss than her clipboard and her smile. Step 1 was paperwork. I spent an entire night pulling contracts, invoices, and service orders from my company's files. My office server had timestamps, delivery receipts, the whole chain of custody for that bulldozer job. I printed everything and arranged it on the kitchen table, the documents forming a neat, undeniable trail: Margaret's authorization, the invoice number, the payment confirmation, and the crew work logs that matched the time my garden was destroyed. Each page tightened the net. Step 2 was evidence that couldn't be explained away as neighborhood gossip. I had crew phones with GPS logs, camera footage from our trucks, and delivery manifests showing the machine's route. All of it put the demolition squarely on an HOA order that carried her signature. If the HOA wanted to argue technicalities, I'd let the paper and data do the talking. Step 3 was neighbors. People respect facts from people they know. I started quietly talking to folks who'd been on the receiving end of Margaret's petty tyranny: the couple who got fined for a pink flamingo, the retired teacher whose mailbox color was deemed offensive, the landscaper who'd been hired and then blacklisted for questioning her. Most were terrified of retaliation. But when I showed them the contract and the receipts, their fear became outrage. One by one, they agreed to sign witness statements describing Margaret's pattern of selective enforcement. Not because I asked them to be dramatic, but because their lived experiences matched the paperwork I'd collected. Step 4 was the legal path. I'm not a lawyer, but I know how the construction world works, and I know that documentation is how you turn a messy personal spat into a formal complaint that authorities can't ignore. I contacted an attorney who specialized in municipal and real estate disputes. He read everything and said 3 words I needed to hear: "This is actionable." He drafted a demand letter: restitution for the destroyed garden, reimbursement for cleanup costs, and a request for the HOA meeting minutes that justified the action. Most importantly, he advised we request an immediate review of the HOA's authorization processes and a conflict of interest disclosure concerning Margaret and any company tied to her. Step 5, and this one mattered more to me than the legalese, was public exposure. People can hide behind bylaws and forms, but they struggle when the story becomes something everyone can understand: a family's home destroyed under the guise of regulation. I wrote a concise timeline of events, attached the contract scans, and emailed a local reporter who'd covered neighborhood corruption before. I kept the message factual, not vengeful. Facts stick. Outrage follows. There was one moral line I refused to cross. I wouldn't fabricate evidence, and I wouldn't do anything that would harm the workers who'd been ordered to do a job. They were just people following instructions. My fight was with the system and the one person who'd weaponized it. I wanted the truth to come out clean and undeniable, not smeared with petty tricks. Finally, there was a tactical play I saved for when the timing was perfect. My company's name was on the invoice. If Margaret wanted to claim she'd been duped by a contractor's mislabeling, she'd need to explain why she signed the authorization and why her HOA paid it. I planned to present the original contract and the payment trail at the next HOA meeting, not to yell, but to lay the documents on the table and let silence do the rest. Facts are loud in a quiet room. Over the next week, I executed the plan methodically. I filed the formal complaint, I delivered the demand letter, and I set a meeting with the HOA board and the city inspector. I organized the neighbor witness statements and handed a packet to the reporter. Each small action was a brick, and together they began to build a structure too solid to ignore. But strategy alone doesn't erase what was lost: the crushed roses, the upturned soil, the space where my daughter used to imagine treehouses. What it did do was turn my helpless anger into a force that could move through systems, legal channels, community pressure, and the court of public opinion. And while the tension built, something else happened that surprised me. People started looking at Margaret differently. Her clipped smile seemed less confident. The clipboard she clutched so tightly now looked like a paper shield fragile when the truth came knocking. I wasn't naive. I knew Margaret would fight back. She had friends on the board, and she wasn't above twisting words and processes to her advantage. But I'd transformed the situation from an emotional reaction into a process. And processes, unlike impulses, win court cases, change public narratives, and, most importantly, protect families. So when the HOA called for a special meeting to discuss community standards, I was ready. I had facts, neighbors, a lawyer, and a plan to make sure Margaret couldn't sell her little kingdom as righteousness anymore. The night of the special HOA meeting, the clubhouse was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Usually, these gatherings drew a handful of bored homeowners flipping through pamphlets. But that night, there were at least 40 people, all whispering, trading looks, waiting for a show. Margaret stood at the front, as always, clipboard in hand, papers perfectly aligned. She was dressed sharper than usual, dark blue suit, hair pinned, that same smug calmness she wore when she believed she was untouchable. I sat near the back at first, just listening. She started the meeting the same way she always did, voice dripping with authority. Good evening, everyone. Tonight's meeting will focus on recent concerns about compliance violations and community maintenance issues. She might as well have been reading from a script. Everything sounded rehearsed, controlled until she got to my name. Now, regarding the landscaping violation at 243 Hillside Drive, she continued, the board has reviewed the incident and determined that all actions taken were in accordance with HOA bylaws. Any property owner concerns should be directed to the board in writing. I stood up. That's convenient, I said, loud enough for the back row to hear, because I did write to the board. Twice. You ignored me both times. All heads turned. Margaret's smile tightened, but she gestured with feigned patience. Mr. Taylor, if you have a concern, please take a seat until the open comment period. I stayed standing. Oh, I'm not here to comment. I'm here to present something. She frowned. That's not on the agenda. I lifted a thick folder from under my arm. It is now. The tension in the room thickened as I walked to the front. I could feel every step echo through the silence. When I reached the podium, I set the folder down and opened it papers, invoices, photos, signatures, everything arranged in order. I looked directly at her. Margaret, you authorized the demolition of my garden. You signed this work order. I did no such, she began, but I cut her off, sliding the contract across the table. Your signature. Your authorization. The HOA paid my company for the job my company, Margaret. That caught her off guard. Her hand froze halfway to the clipboard. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Yes, I continued, voice calm but firm. The crew you hired to bulldoze my yard works for me. You destroyed my property using my own people and then fined me for the damage. The murmurs turned into whispers, then quiet gasps. Margaret tried to gather herself. That's absurd. I had no idea. Really? I interrupted. Because here's the invoice with the HOA's payment, here's the time-stamped job order from our internal system, and here's your signature matching the authorization form. I spread the papers out for everyone to see. A couple of board members leaned forward, reading quickly, their faces tightening as they realized what they were looking at. Then I added one more sheet, a copy of the demand letter from my lawyer. This is a formal claim for property destruction, restitution, and violation of homeowner rights. It's also been filed with the city inspector's office and the county's legal department. For the first time, Margaret's composure cracked. Her lips pressed together, and the color drained from her face. I wasn't aware of the company's ownership, she stammered. The board approved the work collectively. But one of the board members interrupted her. No, you pushed this, Margaret. You told us it was a simple cleanup, said you had all the paperwork handled. We trusted you. Now the room was buzzing. People were whispering louder, neighbors shaking their heads, some openly glaring at her. I didn't have to say much else. The documents spoke louder than any speech I could have given. I closed the folder slowly and said, "You destroyed something that wasn't yours to touch, and you did it with arrogance. I built my garden myself, but I'm rebuilding something bigger now, accountability." The board called for a 10-minute recess. Margaret tried to slip out quietly, but a local reporter I'd tipped off earlier intercepted her at the door, camera rolling. The flash from the lens caught the exact moment she realized this was bigger than a neighborhood argument. When the meeting reconvened, the board issued a temporary suspension of her authority pending investigation. It wasn't a full victory yet, but the crowd applauded. For the first time, Margaret didn't have the final word. After the meeting ended, a few neighbors came up to me. People I barely knew shook my hand. The elderly man next door, who'd once been fined for leaving his porch light on past midnight, actually smiled for the first time in months. "Thank you," he said quietly. Someone finally stood up to her. I nodded. It wasn't just me. It was everyone who got tired of being pushed around. As I left the clubhouse that night, I looked back once more. The same place that had felt like her throne now looked smaller, dimmer, just a room with chairs and paper. Her kingdom was cracking, and the truth was the wrecking ball. The following week, the neighborhood felt different. For the first time in months, people weren't avoiding eye contact on the sidewalks. Conversations that used to stop when Margaret walked by were happening openly again. It was as if a heavy storm had passed, and everyone was finally breathing clean air. I didn't hear from her for a few days, no notices, no calls, no urgent HOA updates. Just silence. But that silence didn't last long. By Friday, my phone buzzed with an alert from a local news site. HOA president under investigation for misuse of funds. The article didn't hold back. It detailed how multiple homeowners had come forward with complaints, unfair fines, unauthorized projects, suspiciously inflated maintenance costs. One of those projects was, of course, my garden. Apparently, the city had received so many formal grievances after the meeting that they launched a full audit of the HOA's finances. Every contract, every invoice, every emergency landscaping expense, all under review. And guess whose name was on most of them? You guessed it, Margaret's. That's when I got the call from my attorney. "They're offering a settlement," he said. "Full restitution for the garden, plus additional compensation for damages. They want to close this quietly." I laughed. Of course they do. Still, I took the offer. Not out of mercy, but because I didn't need to drag it further. The truth was already doing its job. Within 2 weeks, Margaret officially resigned from the HOA for personal reasons. That's what the email said, anyway. But everyone knew the real story. Her spotless reputation, gone. Her control over the community, finished. And her smug confidence, replaced by the same quiet fear she used to project onto everyone else. The morning after her resignation, I stepped outside with a cup of coffee. The construction crew, my crew, was back at work, this time rebuilding my garden exactly how it used to be. The hum of the machinery was music to my ears. As I stood there, my neighbor from across the street, Mr. Jenkins, walked over. "She's gone for good?" he asked. "Looks like it," I said. He chuckled. "About time. That woman fined me once because my flagpole was an inch too tall." We both laughed. It felt good not just because I'd won, but because the neighborhood finally felt human again. Later that afternoon, I went to drop off some documents at City Hall. As I was walking out, I saw Margaret in the lobby. No clipboard this time, no power suit, just a plain gray jacket and a folder tucked under her arm. For a moment, we locked eyes. She looked tired, smaller somehow. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but I just nodded once, not out of anger, but finality. Then I walked past her without a word. Because some endings don't need to be spoken. A few weeks later, my garden was finished even better than before. Rows of fresh flowers, stone edging, soft lighting that came alive at dusk. People started stopping by just to compliment it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a little girl from 2 houses down came running over with her mom. She wanted to see the new garden, her mom said, smiling. The girl stared wide-eyed at the flowers. "It's so pretty," she whispered. I smiled back. "You know what's even prettier?" I said. "When people stop trying to ruin things they don't understand." A few months later, the HOA held new elections. This time, instead of being run like a mini dictatorship, it became what it was supposed to be, a community. They even asked if I'd like to join the board. I politely declined. I told them, I'm happy just keeping the power tools running, not the politics. Everyone laughed, but we all knew what I meant. The lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up, even when the rules seem stacked against you. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person saying enough to remind everyone else they still have a voice. And as I sat on my porch that night, the rebuilt garden glowing under the lights, I realized something. Margaret had bulldozed my yard, but in doing so, she planted the seeds of her own downfall. People always say karma takes its time. But standing there, watching the lights flicker across my rebuilt garden, I realized sometimes karma doesn't wait. Sometimes it borrows your toolbox and lets you do the digging. When Margaret ordered that bulldozer, she wasn't just tearing up my lawn. She was tearing down the little bit of decency that holds communities together: respect, fairness, accountability. She thought a title gave her the right to step on people. But power without empathy? That's just destruction wearing a badge. And when people like that finally fall, it's not loud or dramatic. It's quiet. It's when nobody listens to them anymore. Over the next few months, I noticed something amazing. Neighbors started helping each other again. The same people who used to hide behind closed blinds when Margaret walked by were now planting flowers, sharing tools, chatting across fences. The neighborhood finally felt alive the way it was supposed to feel. That's when I understood something deeper. Winning isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. Sure, I could have dragged Margaret through court, humiliated her in public, or rubbed her failure in her face. But what would that prove? That I could out-bully a bully? No. The real victory was getting my peace and my power back. And maybe that's the part most people miss in stories like this. When someone wrongs you, it's tempting to fight fire with fire. But the smarter move? Let them light the match and then watch them burn their own bridge. A few days ago, I got a letter from a nearby neighborhood. Their HOA president had just been reported for unauthorized modifications and misuse of member funds. I couldn't help but smile. History repeating itself? Or maybe people are finally learning that you can only abuse power for so long before it circles back. And who knows, maybe that's where my next story begins. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: there's always another Karen out there. But there's also always someone ready to stand up quietly, firmly, and with proof in hand. So the next time someone tries to bulldoze you, literally or metaphorically, remember this story. Remember that silence doesn't mean surrender. And remember that sometimes the best revenge is letting the truth do the heavy lifting. PAUSE soft outro tone. If you enjoyed this story, buckle up, the next one will make this look like a warm-up. Because let's just say the next Karen I met didn't stop at a noise complaint. She tried to shut down an entire construction site, but she forgot one tiny detail. I am the inspector.its funny. Most people think being a power inspector is all about wires, generators, and regulations. But the truth is, it's about something far simpler: integrity. You'll learn early in this line of work that power isn't about voltage, it's about responsibility. Every time I step onto a site, I remind myself that one wrong decision can leave a family in the dark. One overlooked detail can start a fire. And one signature, the wrong one, can ruin someone's home. That's what made Margaret's arrogance so dangerous. She never understood the weight that comes with power. She used it like a toy instead of a tool. But for people like me, people who build things, power is sacred. You respect it. You control it. Because the moment you abuse it, it burns you back. A few weeks after everything settled, the city invited me to speak at a local homeowners workshop about property compliance and ethics. Normally, I avoid public talks. I'm better with machines than microphones. But this time, I said yes. When I walked into that community hall, I saw faces that looked just like my neighbors, frustrated, tired, and maybe a little afraid to speak up. So I told them the truth. I told them about Margaret, about the garden, about the fine, the audit, the downfall. But more importantly, I told them what not to do. Never fight anger with anger, I said. Fight it with precision, paperwork, proof. Because bullies crumble fast when you bring facts to a fight. The room was silent for a moment, and then applause. Not the kind you get for being dramatic, the kind that says, "Finally, someone said it." After the talk, a man walked up to me, older guy, retired engineer. He said, "You know, son, I've dealt with my fair share of Margarets. And every time, I wished I had the guts to do what you did." I smiled and shook his hand. "You don't need guts," I said. "You just need to know where the switch is and when to flip it." That night, as I drove home, I passed by the old HOA building. The lights were still on, but the big gold plaque that once read President Margaret Hill was gone. Just an empty space, waiting for a new name. And it hit me: power always changes hands. But character, that's what decides what happens when it does. Margaret thought she was untouchable. She thought her rules made her important. But in the end, the only rule that mattered was the one she broke: do the right thing, even when no one's watching. I parked outside my house and looked at the garden one last time before going in. It was quiet, peaceful, lit softly by the garden lights that hummed gently under the night sky. No engines, no shouting, no fines taped to my door. Just calm. I took a slow breath and smiled. Because I didn't just rebuild a garden. I rebuilt a boundary. And in this world, that's worth more than any victory. Soft pause, outrow hook for the next story. The funny thing about stories like this? They never really end. Because just when you think peace has settled in, a new storm starts brewing somewhere else. And when it does well, you know who they'll call to inspect it. A few months passed. The chaos had faded into memory, replaced by something quieter, steadier. Every morning, I'd step out with my coffee and listen to the soft hum of the generator. Not the angry rumble of machinery, just a gentle, steady pulse. The sound of power doing what it's supposed to do: work with you, not against you. The neighborhood had changed too. The fences were freshly painted. Kids played in the streets again. Neighbors who used to keep their blinds drawn now waved when I passed. It wasn't perfect, no community ever is, but it finally felt alive. Sometimes, I'd catch people slowing down as they walked by my yard. They'd stop, look at the rebuilt garden, and smile like it reminded them that no matter how messy things get, you can always start over. And maybe that's what stuck with me most. Not the fight, not the paperwork, not even the so-called revenge, but the rebuilding. Because rebuilding is where real strength shows up. anyone can destroy. But to create again, after someone's tried to tear you down, that takes something deeper. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and the air turned gold, I heard a knock on my door. It was a delivery, a small package with no return address. Inside was a single note. Sometimes it takes losing control to understand what control really means. M. Margaret. No threats, no fines, no legal jargon. Just that. I didn't know if it was apology, closure, or guilt. Maybe all three. But I folded the note, slipped it into my desk drawer, and smiled. Because, in a way, it didn't matter anymore. She'd finally learned the lesson. And so had I. Weeks later, during a city inspection round, I found myself driving past another HOA community, new buildings, shiny mailboxes, perfect lawns. And right there, at the front gate, was a small sign that read, "Respect builds stronger neighborhoods." I chuckled. Maybe someone had heard the story. Maybe Margaret's fall had made more ripples than I realized. Either way, it was enough. As I turned the truck around, the radio buzzed with a new call, another complaint, another inspection, another story waiting to unfold. And as the city lights flickered on in the distance, I thought back to everything that had happened. Power, control, integrity, all of it came down to one simple truth. When you stand your ground with honesty and patience, the world has a funny way of turning the lights back on. So yeah, that's how my garden got bulldozed, rebuilt, and became the most talked about yard in the county. Not because of the flowers, but because it reminded people that no one, not even a self-appointed queen of an HOA, is above the rules of decency. And if that isn't poetic justice, I don't know what is.it had been nearly a year since the whole Margaret incident. Life had gone back to normal, or at least as normal as it gets in a neighborhood that once made national news for a bulldozed garden. The flowers had flourished. The grass was green again. Every inch of my yard told a story of chaos, patience, and quiet victory. Most mornings, I'd sit on the porch, sipping coffee, scrolling through work requests for inspections. I didn't think much about what had happened anymore. It was just another chapter closed. Until one Thursday morning, I got a call. It came through my work line, labeled Private Client Urgent Review. I almost ignored it. But something, maybe curiosity, maybe instinct, made me answer. "Mr. Taylor," a woman's voice said, calm but nervous. "We need your help with a compliance issue." I sighed softly. "What kind of issue?" She hesitated. "It's a power complaint. Someone's claiming unsafe generator use in their neighborhood." That caught my attention. I leaned forward. "Where exactly?" She gave me the address. It was one town over a quiet suburb, the kind that looked peaceful on Google Maps, but had HOA nightmares written all over it. I opened my laptop, typed in the community name, and there it was, Oak Ridge Estates, HOA. And the name listed as current president? Margaret Hill. I sat there for a moment, staring at the screen. The same woman who had tried to ruin me had somehow landed in another neighborhood. Old habits die hard, I guess. I didn't respond right away. I just sat back and let out a slow breath. It wasn't anger I felt, not even surprise. Just that quiet, familiar awareness that some people never learn. But this time, it wasn't my neighborhood. It wasn't my fight. I almost declined the case until I remembered her note. Sometimes, it takes losing control to understand what control really means. I smiled faintly. Maybe she was trying to do things differently now. Or maybe she wasn't. Either way, I had to know. 2 days later, I drove to Oak Ridge Estates. New streets, new homes, the same kind of manicured lawns that always hide bigger problems underneath. As I pulled up to the address listed on the complaint, I saw her standing in the driveway, clipboard in hand, arguing with a contractor. Same posture, same tone, same control. For a second, she saw me and froze. Then that same half-smile crept across her face, except this time, it wasn't smug. It was restrained. "Mr. Taylor," she said quietly, setting the clipboard down. "Didn't expect to see you again," I replied. She nodded. "Yeah, I figured you wouldn't." The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was heavy. Like two people standing on the border between past and peace. Then she said, "This time I'm trying to do things the right way." I studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Then let's start by checking the wiring," I said. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret didn't argue. She just followed. As I inspected the generator, I realized something important. Maybe people don't change overnight. Maybe power, the real kind, isn't about control or punishment. It's about guidance, accountability, and second chances. When I finished, she thanked me. No sarcasm, no attitude, just gratitude. And as I packed up my tools, I turned back and said, "Keep the lights steady this time." She smiled softly. "I will." As I drove away, the sky was turning orange, the same golden hue that used to hit my garden fence back home. The world, it seemed, had come full circle. Because sometimes the people who bulldoze your peace end up learning how to rebuild their own. And when that happens, when you see the storm calm instead of strike again, you realize something. The real power was never in the title, the fine, or the rule book. It was in the reset.